History isn't just written in blood, it's etched in salt and rust. In the dying light of July 1945, the world believed it knew the face of war. It was a face of firebombed cities and mud-caked trenches. But in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge, a different kind of monster was waking up. It was made of 10,000 tons of steel and carried a secret that would rewrite the definition of the end. The USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, a sleek, lethal aristocrat of the Pacific Fleet. She had survived kamikaze attacks and the brutal grinding of the Aleutian campaign. She was the Indy, the pride of the Navy. But as she sat in the docks of San Francisco, she wasn't just a ship anymore. She was a delivery system for a godlike power. A high-speed sprint across the obsidian waters of the Pacific was her final mission. No escort, no radio contact, just a 600-foot machine of war, alone in the vast, uncaring blue, carrying a cargo that made even the highest-ranking officers tremble. Little did the 900 men on board know that they were delivering the instrument of one apocalypse, only to sail directly into another, one made of teeth, thirst, and in silence so deep it could swallow a soul. The cargo arrived in a shroud of mystery that would have been comical if it wasn't so terrifying. 2 lead-lined containers and a large wooden crate. The dock workers were pushed aside by Marines with orders to shoot to kill. The crew of the Indy watched from the railings, whispering, was it gold? Was it a new biological weapon? Was it the secret to ending the war in a single afternoon? Captain Charles McVay III received his orders in a windowless room. They were simple. You will sail at maximum speed. You will not deviate. You will not stop for anything. If you are sunk, your cargo must be the first thing saved, and the men the last. Inside those containers sat the components for Little Boy, the uranium core of the first atomic bomb. The Indianapolis was now the most important vessel on the planet, a silver needle threading through the Japanese submarine picket lines. Every vibration of her massive turbines, every groan of her steel hull, seemed to echo with the weight of the new world they were carrying. They weren't just sailors anymore. They were the pallbearers for the old world. They reached the island of Tinian in record time, offloaded the seeds of fire, and turned back toward the Leyte Gulf. They thought the hard part was over. They thought they had survived the secret. July 30th, 1945. The Philippine Sea was a sheet of black glass reflecting a moonless sky. The Indianapolis was cruising at 17 knots, a solitary shadow moving through the dark. Beneath the surface, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of the Japanese submarine. I-58 peered through his periscope. He didn't see a ship. He saw a ghost, a massive, unescorted target that shouldn't have been there. He didn't hesitate. Kaiten, launch! At 12:14 a.m., the first torpedo struck the bow. The explosion was a blinding white flash that vaporized the forward mess decks, killing dozens in their sleep. Seconds later, the second torpedo found the midships, detonating directly under the fuel tanks and the powder magazines. The Indianapolis didn't just sink, she disintegrated from the inside out. The power failed instantly. The internal communications died. In the pitch-black corridors, men scrambled through waist-deep oil and fire, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the stench of heavy fuel. There was no time for a coordinated abandon ship order. The ship was tilting at a horrific 45 degrees, the massive propellers still spinning in the air, screaming like dying beasts. 12 minutes. That is all it took for 10,000 tons of American engineering to be dragged into the abyss. And as the bubbles settled and the screaming stopped, the survivors realized the ocean hadn't just taken their ship. It had invited them into a purgatory where the rules of civilization no longer applied. When the sun rose on July 30th, it didn't bring hope. It brought a brutal, blinding clarity. Roughly 900 men were scattered across miles of the Philippine Sea. Some were lucky enough to find life rafts or floater nets, but hundreds of others were suspended in the water by nothing but Kapok life vests. Vests that were designed to stay buoyant for 48 hours, not a lifetime. The first thing they noticed was the oil. The Indianapolis had bled her lifeblood. Thousands of gallons of heavy black fuel oil onto the surface. It coated the men like a second skin, clogging their eyes, stinging their lungs, and baking into their flesh under the merciless equatorial sun. It was a thick, suffocating mask that erased their identities. You couldn't tell an officer from a seaman. You could only see the whites of their eyes darting in a face of black sludge. But the most terrifying realization was the silence. Because of the secrecy of their mission and the bureaucratic gears of a navy that assumed a ship of that size was safe, no one knew they were gone. The distress signals had vanished into the static of the midnight storm. On the Navy's plotting boards, the Indianapolis was a ghost, a mark on a map that everyone assumed was moving toward its destination. In reality, the men were drifting into a void. They were no longer part of the war. They were no longer part of the machine. They were merely biological matter floating in an obsidian desert. Then came the shadows. It started with a single fin, a gray blade cutting through the oily glass of the water. Then another, and another. These were the oceanic white-tips, the wolves of the deep ocean, scavengers that lived for the vibrations of a sinking ship. At first, they stayed at the periphery, curious about the strange, flailing creatures in the orange skins. The first day was a psychological war. The men stayed in tight circles, back to back, a human fortress of kicking legs and desperate prayers. They thought if they stayed together, they were safe. But the sharks weren't in a hurry. They were efficient. They waited for the weak. They waited for the men who drifted away from the group in their sleep. The first attack happened in the twilight of the first day. There was no warning, only a sudden, violent tug, a splash, and a scream that cut through the sound of the waves. Then, a dark cloud of crimson would bloom in the water, spreading through the black oil. The sharks didn't just bite. They fed. And once the taste of blood hit the water, the curiosity turned into a feeding frenzy. For the next 4 days, the survivors lived in a state of sensory overload. The smell of salt and rot, the sight of the dorsal fins circling like clockwork, and the sound, the splashing, the thrashing, and the silence that followed every time the circle of men grew smaller. By the 3rd day, the sun became a weapon of mass destruction. Dehydration began to rot the mind. The salt air turned their tongues into swollen pieces of leather. The thirst was an agonizing physical weight. This is when the islands began to appear. Men began to hallucinate. One sailor would scream that he could see the Indianapolis just 10 feet below the surface, perfectly intact, with the lights on and the galley serving cold milk. He would tell his friends he was going down to get a drink. He would take off his life vest and swim down into the blue, never to return. Others saw phantom islands on the horizon or cities of gold. The social contract of the Navy, the discipline, the rank, the brotherhood, dissolved into a primal struggle for survival. Men began to fight over pieces of debris. Some accused their comrades of being Japanese spies. The ocean wasn't just killing their bodies, it was dismantling their humanity. They were becoming as cold and predatory as the creatures circling beneath them. This was the industrial noir of the human soul, the complete breakdown of the person when the mechanical support of the ship is removed. They were hardware without a motherboard, sparks fading in a cold, wet dark. On the morning of the 4th day, August 2nd, the survivors were no longer men. They were driftwood. They were waiting for the end in a state of catatonic surrender. They didn't look at the horizon anymore. They didn't pray for ships. They only waited for the next tug at their legs from the shadows below. The miracle didn't come from a rescue mission. It came from a routine patrol. Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was piloting a PV-1 Ventura bomber, hunting for Japanese submarines. He wasn't looking for the Indianapolis. He didn't even know she was missing. He was fixing a dragging antenna when he looked down through the glass and saw an oil slick. Then he saw heads. He saw hundreds of black, oily dots bobbing in the swells. He didn't know what he was seeing at first. He thought it might be a Japanese crew from a sunken sub. But then he saw the frantic waving of a single oil-soaked arm. Gwynn dropped a life raft and a radio, and the message he sent back to base ignited a firestorm of panic and shame within the Navy High Command. Am radioing position. Many men in water. They had been missing for 84 hours, and the Navy had only just realized they were gone. The rescue was not a calculated success. It was a desperate attempt to cover up a monumental failure of the machine. The first ship to arrive was the USS Cecil J. Doyle. As its searchlights cut through the darkness of the fifth night, The crew saw a sight that would haunt them until their dying days. The ocean was alive, but not with men. It was alive with ghosts. The survivors were so coated in oil and salt that they looked like statues carved from obsidian. The sailors on the rescue ships had to pull the men out of the water one by one. Many of the survivors were so weak that their skin peeled off in the hands of their rescuers, the salt and oil having turned their flesh into something fragile and alien. And always, just outside the reach of the searchlights, the fins remained. The sharks stayed until the very last man was lifted from the water, as if they were waiting for the Navy to finish its harvest. The numbers were a punch to the gut. Out of the 1,195 men who had sailed from San Francisco, only 316 remained. Nearly 600 men had been taken by the sea, the thirst, and the teeth. It remains the greatest single loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the United States Navy. The pride of the fleet had become a mass grave, and the bureaucracy that had failed to protect them was already looking for someone to blame. In the aftermath of the war, as the world celebrated victory, Captain Charles McVay III stood in a courtroom. The Navy needed a scapegoat to distract from the fact that they had lost a heavy cruiser and didn't notice for 4 days. They charged him with hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, despite the fact that the ocean was thick with fog and the maneuver wouldn't have mattered. In a move of unprecedented coldness, the Navy even brought in Commander Hashimoto, the man who had sunk the Indianapolis, to testify against McVay. Hashimoto told the court that zigzagging would not have saved the ship. It didn't matter. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. McVay was convicted. His career was over, but his nightmare was just beginning. For the next 20 years, McVay lived in a quiet, suburban purgatory. Every year, on the anniversary of the sinking, he received letters from the families of the dead. "Why did my son die while you lived? You are a murderer." The industrial noir of the story ends not in the ocean, but on a cold November day in 1968. McVay walked onto his back porch in Litchfield, Connecticut, holding a toy sailor in one hand and his service revolver in the other. He ended his life, becoming the final casualty of a mission that began in secrecy and ended in a sea of teeth. For 72 years, the USS Indianapolis remained a legend, a ghost ship lost in the deepest parts of the Philippine Sea. But in 2017, the silence was finally broken. An expedition led by Paul Allen located the wreck 18,000 feet below the surface, 3.5 miles down. The images returned by the ROV were staggering. The ship sits perfectly upright on the silt, its massive guns still pointing toward a horizon it will never reach. The pride of the Navy is preserved in the freezing, high-pressure darkness, protected from the sun and the sharks at last. The story of the Indy is a reminder that in the grand machine of war, the human heart is the most fragile component. It is a story of a secret that changed the world, and a sea that refused to forget. Was McVeigh a criminal or a victim of a system too big to admit its own faults? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to join us for our next descent into the gritty, rusted heart of history. The abyss is deep, and we have only just begun to look inside.